To go. All right.
So what we've been talking about thus far is the way in which cyber technology has changed crimes in general and also changed the nature of how we interact with the world. Right now, we're going to talk about it's not just that what cyber technology has done has changed the nature of an individual thing like crime. It's rather that it's changed the entire landscape of what the world's like. And the lines between things like crime and war and diplomacy and all of these things, which if you don't care about, you should, are blurred. So, I think the best way. What's crime? We just described it. In general, what's crimes? Or what are
the law?
Yeah, breaking the law. And specifically, where do laws apply?
Government or
Yeah.
any institution.
Yeah, it's government level. So if there are laws, it's dependent on where you are and what governing bodies are in charge of you. And if you break the law, who comes after you? Yeah, the police, very often the local police, or the national police, or in very extreme cases, international police. But, and it's the FBI in certain cases, but it's more often than not like a local government organization. All right, that's crime. There's an overlap between crime and terrorism. So what did we say terrorism was? Yeah, it's actions you carry out to cause damage, to cause in turn to cause fear. So the goal of terrorism is almost every terrorist act basically is a crime by definition. Only who the crime is against depends. So, but how you carry it out and who comes after you depends on the nature of the crime. But it's always going to be an instance of crime. Now, why next to the word terrorism is there a parentheses and resistance? Why do I have terrorism, parentheses, and resistance? Why are terrorism and resistance on the same line? What do I mean by resistance, first off?
Possibly saying that, resistance is a form of maybe like rebellious.
Yeah. What's the difference between a freedom fighter and a terrorist?
It's just like the intention itself, like who are you fighting for? That's the main thing.
One is good and one's evil.
And
well, I mean, I don't know, because people might think that fighting for freedom might be.
Yeah. Here's the answer. Which side of the fence you're standing on?
Yeah.
The same person's freedom fighter, when somebody joins, say, ISIS, or somebody joins an organization that is trying to instill fear, how do they think of themselves?
Freedom fighter.
A freedom fighter. Nobody ever goes, I'm going to be a terrorist when I grow up. You're going to say something like, I'm fighting for the greater good. Name some terrorists in American history. Osama bin Laden. Name some U.S.-based terrorists. One of them would be somebody like Timothy McVeigh, who was the Oklahoma City bomber. But let's think of some more famous ones. All the school mass shooters. We're all naming ones that you don't like. Let's name some terrorist acts that you're not necessarily sure you are unhappy about.
What if there's like terrorists that just like commanded entire groups of people? Because like technically they didn't do the terror act themselves, but they ordered it.
And so this is very often the case, and that's like something like Osama bin Laden was. He was not on a plane. He ordered people in the cells to pull it out. And I think it really comes down to like how much blame, and this goes back to earlier with our many hands problem, where do you assign the blame? And it seems like in this sort of case, like if the person gives orders and the other people answer to them, then it seems like they deserve blame, but also the people who carry it out do, provided they're not being like forced one way or the other. But who are some terrorists you like?
I have some different things to say on
Yeah.
this context. Do you believe that it was the Osama bin Laden?
I'm not getting into conspiracy theories right now, so I'm going to dodge this answer as hard as I can and say, I'm not answering. That's what I'm going to say. But, all right, think back to, how many of you took a U.S. history class? Why am I playing with this paper? How many of you have taken a U.S. history class? What happened in the late
Oh, history.
1700s.
That was a civil war.
No, that was the mid-1800s.
Independence.
So are you talking about, the
Oh,
Protestant-
Declaration.
Declaration of Independence, and leading up to that, we had a revolution. We broke away from the United Kingdom, which was our overlord, and we were a colony. Along the way, such things were carried out, like a whole bunch of people broke onto a boat and threw a bunch of tea into the water. We had other cases in which people were destroying goods. They were meeting secretly and plotting rebellions against their rightful government. Sounds a lot to me like that was a terrorist group. Sounds a lot to me like that was a terrorist organization looking to overthrow the government. You know what we call them? The Founding Fathers. Which side you stand on makes a big difference. Who was Nelson Mandela, and what is he known for now?
Jeez.
Ending the apartheid.
Yeah, what was apartheid? It was basically the South African, like, extreme segregation, where people who were of, basically, if, it was like Jim Crow in the United States, only on possibly even more strict. And there were rules in South Africa about if you were white, you were not allowed to marry or have children with a black person, and it was a crime if you did, and things like this. It didn't end until the late 80s, early 90s, and the person who was most instrumental in this, or the person who's most associated with it, was the first president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela, when all this was going on, was in prison for what? Anyone know? Terrorism. He was a terrorist, according to the British government. And then the associate. So the line of where you stand on whether it's terrorism or resistance is really which side of the fence you're on. And there's no clear-cut way on these sorts of things. It really comes down to what you believe in and whether you should believe in that. And there are certain things that, like, terrorist actions cannot be excused at all. Like, you know, you shouldn't be blowing up children regardless of which side of the fence you're on. But people are going to, from one side, it's going to be worth it for the greater good, and these sorts of things. So that's what you see with terrorism and resistance. So, in the same way in which cyber has changed crime and terrorism, it's also increased the ability of groups to resist and organize. And so here's another way in which cyber has affected it. It's not just that we see cyber leading to bombings and things like that, it's also groups of people who we look at and say are freedom fighters. Cyber's affecting how they resist, how they connect with each other, how they connect with getting assistance, how they can use Facebook to organize. And the same sorts of things that are being used, like right now, Facebook just got a message from the Attorney General and I think the President and the head of the British version of the secret of their like CIA, and I'm not sure if it was I'm not sure if it was MI6 or whether it was their version of like the NSA. Basically, Facebook just got a big bunch of things. And what was this? Also Australia was involved. This letter which they received today, what did it say? Does anyone know what it was demanding?
Oh, Julia asked.
No.
No.
It was demanding that WhatsApp install a backdoor on their encryption program. It was telling them that if you do not install a backdoor on your, because WhatsApp currently I don't think automatically encrypts, and they're looking to end-to-end user encrypt. And it'll automatically be there, so if anyone got a hold of your phone and couldn't get in, they wouldn't be able to read your WhatsApp messages from the outside. And if somebody showed up at Facebook with a court order that said you have to unencrypt this, Facebook would say, we can't, we don't have the code. And so the Attorney General and all these groups have come out and said, no, you shouldn't, there needs to be a backdoor so that if somebody's using WhatsApp who's a terrorist or something like that, it can be accessed. And so the resistance, of course, is privacy versus law enforcement. But you can see the same sorts of, WhatsApp is being used by people the United States are calling terrorists, and also people the United States are calling freedom fighters. And so that's the big thing. All right. These are also now related to espionage. What is espionage or covert operations? Spying. What do we mean by spying? What is spying?
Collecting information for the military or others.
Yeah, exactly. It's just a matter of getting information for your own nation from another nation. So, for instance, like who's the most famous fictional spy? James Bond. What does James Bond do? Well, he also blows up a lot of stuff. But in theory, he's just collecting information and getting rid of people that the British government doesn't want anymore. Any sort of secret agent falls into this spy. Now, most spying is way less interesting than James Bond. It usually just involves like going places, taking notes, and sending them back to the government, who then takes them and collects them. And the most famous era of spies in world history probably is the Cold War, because no real war happened from 1945 to 1989. But the Russians had a bunch of spies here, and we had a bunch of spies there, and people were collecting information and trying to figure out, and yada yada. So that's what we mean by espionage. What's covert ops? So espionage is just collecting and spying and that sort of thing. What's covert operations?
Probably like the next level.
Yeah, it's basically the same sort of thing where it's not carried out by an army or anything like that, but it involves more active participation in another country than espionage does. Espionage is just, you know, kind of passive. You're collecting information, you're gathering things, you're finding out how they do things. Covert ops is, it's not quite war, but it's sending in people to take care of things using the information that has been collected during an espionage exploration or expedition or mission. Basically, the same people can be carrying out both. This is just getting the information, this is putting it to use in ways that do not quite involve war, but involve a lot of the same sorts of things. So what are some examples of covert operations that have happened?
In the Palestine and the Syria, Middle East war.
Yeah, so yeah, a lot of things that are happening in Israel and Palestine. There's not officially a war going on, but there are special forces who break into houses to find people and all that sort of stuff. Depending on, well, here's another classic one. When Osama bin Laden was, yeah, Osama bin Laden, what happened to him? Oh, yeah, he was killed. Where was he when he was killed? He was in Pakistan. We were not at war with Pakistan. He was in like a somewhat loosely controlled area in rural Pakistan. U.S. ground forces went on the ground without getting like all the necessary like legal permission, all this sort of stuff, went in and assassinated him. This is an example of covert ops. Also, if you have a country where you aren't happy with their government because they're not supporting your government and you want to overthrow them. This was very common during the Cold War. Many cases in which the United States didn't like a certain government because they weren't being beneficial to us. So between sending in CIA operatives and various other things, people were assassinated, elections were rigged. That's all covert operations. So, diplomacy. What's diplomacy?
I'm assuming that's your allegiance to your country.
So it's tied in with allegiance to your country. What are some classic, there's a lot of diplomacy going on right now between our president and, well, there's two different ones going on right now. Either one of which. One of which is more money-based, the other is more favors-based.
With Ukraine and
yeah, Ukraine. So here's an example of diplomacy. You are a nation, and you tell another nation, you do this for us, we do this for you. It's just a classic sort of exchange. And usually it's above board, and it'll be things like, look, you agree to give us our company's favorable business deals in your nation. In exchange, we will give you this amount of military funding. So for instance, there was a big deal done recently between Iran and China, in which China invested large amounts in the Iranian oil infrastructure in exchange for good deals for Chinese businesses. That's classic diplomacy. Or the sort of thing, if you lead up to any war, like when two nations are saying, you get rid of this, like if you agree to get rid of this, we'll get rid of this and we won't start a war. Or you say, either get rid of this or we're going to war.
So it's like an agreement?
Yeah, so it's basically all the stuff that the State Department is in charge of. So the State Department, the Secretary of State, their job is to interact with other nations. And every nation in the world wants what's best for itself. And every other because everyone wants what's best for themselves, it's hard for everyone to get what they want. Because if everyone wants the same thing, then not everyone's going to get the same, get it, because there's only so much to go around. So diplomacy is countries basically, it's constant negotiations going on amongst countries in the world to try to get the best deal for themselves and their citizens. So other examples of diplomacy, any sort of time in which territory in history has been bought from one place or another. So how did Alaska become part of the United States?
From Russia, they bought
Yeah, we bought it from Russia. That's classic diplomacy. You give us this big place, we give you some money. Or anytime there's what happens when, like not modern wars, which seem to go on forever, but classic like World War II. What happened at the end of World War II? So Hitler's dead. The Japanese have surrendered. What happened next?
They divide the land amongst them.
Yeah, there was a division that happened in Germany where different nations on the winning side agreed to have control over different parts of Germany. So the United States, France, and Britain took the western half of Germany and governed it, and then the Soviet Union took the eastern half, except for the western half of the city of Berlin, which stayed under Western jurisdiction. And so this is the sort of thing that happens with diplomacy. It's just trading. It's a matter of using information. It's a matter of exerting power. Very often with diplomacy, though it's not threats, it's like, there can be some thinly veiled threats of like, if you don't do this, we will invade you, or if you don't do this, we will cut off money to you, or sanctions is another one. So why is it that Iran is not allowed to trade with certain places? Who's decided that Iran is not allowed to trade with certain other countries?
US.
The U.S., and what the U.S. has done is said, anyone who does, we're cutting off diplomatic relations with. And because the United States is powerful in a useful market, also a trade war that's happening right now with China, tariffs, all that is diplomacy. What's war?
Same thing like the coming of the government, if you can't take a decision, then diplomacy. Then
Yeah, war's what happens when diplomacy ends. War's what happens when covert operations and espionage go higher. War's what happens when it's not terrorism, but it's between multiple, full-on, out in the open states. So, who goes to war? If I suddenly get in a fight with Mo, it's not a war. When's it a war?
When I get all my South Bronx relatives.
Yeah, you get your entire relatives, I get all my relatives, it starts becoming a war. Now, what if I move to Canada and I get the entirety of Canada on board with me? He gets the entirety of the United States. Now it's a war. Wars are fights between entire nation states. And by nation states, I mean things like the United States of America, or Brazil, or anything that has a flag that is like a full-on sovereign nation. So that's what we mean by war. What's the point of a war? How do you win a war? Pretty straightforward. Yeah, you kick the other person's butt so bad they give up and say, you win. That's how you win a war. You get the other side to agree to do what you want them to do. Now, in history, wars are typically fought by you put people on the ground and you give them weapons and they literally beat each other up until somebody says, this is enough. That's the way wars usually go. Simple version, but that's it. You just get a bunch of people and they run into each other. Now, all of this stuff is very big picture stuff. One, why are we talking about it? Well, first off, why should you care about any of this crap? What is the reason that you, as a person who lives in the world, should care about any of these things?
Because you could be a victim of like any of those, or you
Yeah,
could be
here's the
part.
thing, is just because you don't know something's going on doesn't mean it can't affect you. Like, the fact is, if your country goes to war, it affects you. The fact is, there's a good chance, how many of you have a family member who has been in any armed forces of any nation around the world? Yeah, that's a tie-in. How many of you have had, like, the way in which, like, one way I said with trade wars, diplomacy, one way you do it is you say, you know what, fine, we're not going to accept your goods anymore. Who does that affect? Everybody. So right now, the U.S. and China are in a pseudo-trade war because Trump said that we are putting, first off, what's a tariff? Anyone know?
Customs.
Yeah, it's basically you say, in order to trade your goods here, we're going to charge you extra. So say we've got this, it's a toy fish, it is coming into America, and it took them, the original price they were going to sell it at is $1. If you have a 20% tariff, how much does the customer now have to pay for it? 120. So that's all a tariff is you just, the government artificially raises the prices and takes it as taxes, which makes whoever made it less of a profit because they have to they don't get to see that 20 cents, but the customers are having to pay it, so they're less likely to buy your product. So with the trade war right now, who's the big winner? There's actually one particular, I don't know how to call him without giving it away, who's winning from the trade war. Anyone know who it is? It's not the United States. We're having economic consequences. It's not China. Not Russia.
India.
No.
Germany?
No.
Brazil.
I'll give you a clue. We invaded it in 1960s.
Taiwan. Oh, sorry, Vietnam.
Vietnam. Why is Vietnam seeing such a benefit? Well, because U.S. companies are moving all of their manufacturing out of China because it costs too much, but it's also costs way too much to put it here, so they're just moving it to Vietnam. So Vietnam is having a major economic benefit from this whole trade war thing. None of the jobs are coming back to America. They're just going to Vietnam instead of China, which is, you know, it is what it is. Welcome to global capitalism. So yeah, these things affect you. And what I want to say is the lines between them in our mind are very clear. We know that terrorism is illegal, but we can think about, like, the line between terrorism and a crime is simple. Or you might think, like, the line between, like, spying is illegal, but we know what it is. Or we know when something's covert operations versus diplomacy. Or we know when we're at war. The issue is with cyber, the lines between all of these are getting less clear. And what we're going to talk about for the rest of the class is how these nice, clean, like, we all have an idea of what a crime looks like, and it doesn't look like war in our heads. Like, these seem like very different things. There are war crimes, which is doing things that are not even allowed in war. Things like mass rapes, beheadings, things like that. Those are war crimes. But things which are usually crimes in a war suddenly aren't. Like, if I go and I blow up the Brooklyn Bridge, it's a crime. But if we were in a war and I was an enemy combatant and that was helping my side, it's not really a crime anymore. It's unfortunate. So that's this. But when we get over here to cyber technology, it's fundamentally changing the game. So I put 4 things up here. All of them, maybe we'll get to all of them, maybe we won't. All 4 of these things have a fundamental tie-in as examples of the way in which international relations and how it affects you have fundamentally changed based on cyber technology. So we've got Olympic Games, 61398, Seth Rogen, and Gerasimov. All of these are directly tied in with modern cyber technology and war and diplomacy. Let's start with Olympic Games. Why does it say Olympic Games up here? What is Olympic Games? And I'm not talking about the actual Olympics. You did.
No, it's because, like, I think it's on the Brazil Olympic Games. It's like, I don't know how to say that.
Keep going. But what I will say is what you're about to say may very well be right, but it's not the answer I am looking for. So I don't mean to cut you off. It's got nothing to do with any. It's got nothing to do with any athletes. There were no athletes involved.
Of course.
I'll give you a clue. The word operation goes before Olympic Games. What was Operation Olympic Games? Any takers yet? How many people have heard this word? Stuxnet. Anyone know what Stuxnet was? Okay. So, the year, I need to look this up exactly. Operation Olympic Games. I need to get the years right. It was carried out okay, started in 2006. I always have trouble with the years. All right, starting in about the year 2006. First off, what is uranium? Uranium. It's an element, and what is it mainly used in? Any sort of nuclear power. So nuclear power runs off of splitting the atoms in uranium. But there's another sort of thing that involves splitting atoms using uranium. What?
Nuclear bombs.
Nuclear bombs. What is the #1 reason that you do not attack another country as a country these days?
Being a nuclear